The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Whitmore Manor as Helena Marchmont Whitmore adjusted her pearl necklace for the third time that evening. The grand dining room, with its mahogany table that could seat 20, felt smaller tonight with only 4 place settings arranged at one end. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the oil paintings of deceased Whitmore patriarchs, their stern faces seeming to judge her every movement. "You're fidgeting again, dear," observed Victoria Whitmore from her position at the head of the table. Helena's mother-in-law had perfected the art of delivering criticism disguised as concern, her voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of Whitmore authority. At 72, Victoria remained the undisputed matriarch of the family, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, her posture rigid as the antique dining chairs they sat upon. Helena's husband, James, barely looked up from his phone as he mechanically cut his beef Wellington. At 45, he had inherited his mother's sharp features, but none of her commanding presence. Instead, he possessed a nervous energy that manifested in constant phone checking and an inability to maintain eye contact during difficult conversations. Tonight was no different. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I suppose I'm just tired," Helena replied, forcing her hands to remain still on her lap. After 3 years of marriage, she had learned that showing weakness in front of her mother-in-law was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. The empty 4th chair at the table belonged to Margaret, James's sister, who had called an hour earlier to cancel dinner. "Emergency at the hospital," she had said, her voice tight with tension. Margaret worked as a pediatric surgeon at St. Catherine's Children's Hospital, and emergencies were unfortunately common in her line of work. "Margaret always was too dedicated to that job," Victoria mused, delicately cutting her vegetables into perfect squares. "A Whitmore woman should focus on family, not on," she paused, her lip curling slightly, "other people's children." Helena felt her stomach tighten. She and James had been trying to have children for 2 years, a fact that Victoria never let them forget. Every family gathering became an opportunity for subtle inquiries about Helena's progress and not-so-subtle suggestions about fertility specialists and adoption agencies. "Margaret saves lives, Victoria. That's hardly something to dismiss," Helena said, immediately regretting the defensive tone in her voice. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her pale blue eyes fixing on Helena with laser-like intensity. "Of course, dear. I simply meant that family should come first. Speaking of which, have you given any more thought to Dr. Badamatsko? Richardson's recommendation? He's had remarkable success with couples in your situation." James finally looked up from his phone, his brown eyes darting between his mother and wife like a tennis spectator. "Mother, perhaps we could discuss this another time." "When, James?" "It's been 3 years. The Whitmore name needs to continue. And at your age," Victoria let the sentence hang in the air like smoke from the candles flickering on the table. Helena excused herself to the powder room, her hands shaking as she gripped the marble countertop. The face staring back at her in the gilded mirror looked older than her 38 years. The stress of trying to fit into a family that seemed determined to remake her in their image had taken its toll. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now seemed dull under the harsh bathroom lighting. The designer dress James had bought her hung awkwardly on her frame, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She thought about the life she had left behind to marry James, her small apartment in the arts district, her job as a graphic designer for a non-profit organization, her circle of friends who had slowly disappeared as she became absorbed into the Whitmore world. James had swept her off her feet with his charm and the promise of a life she had only seen in magazines. But reality had proven far different from the fairy tale she had imagined. When she returned to the dining room, Victoria and James were engaged in hushed conversation that stopped abruptly upon her arrival. The tension in the room was palpable, thick as the cream sauce on their abandoned plates. "Everything all right?" Helena asked, settling back into her chair. "Mother was just mentioning the charity gala next weekend," James said, his voice overly bright. "The one for the Children's Hospital. Margaret will be receiving an award for her work." Victoria's expression suggested she found the entire affair distasteful. 30 years of service to that place. You'd think she could have found something more appropriate for a woman of her station. Helena bit back her response. Margaret was the only member of the Whitmore family who had ever truly welcomed her, spending hours explaining family traditions and offering gentle guidance on navigating Victoria's moods. She was also brilliant, having graduated top of her medical school class before specializing in pediatric surgery. Her dedication to helping sick children was inspiring, not shameful. The conversation was interrupted by James's phone ringing. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's Margaret. She never calls this late unless..." He answered on the second ring. "Maggie? What's wrong?" Helena watched her husband's face drain of color as he listened to his sister. His free hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white against the dark wood. "How many children?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus, Maggie. Are you sure about the cause?" Victoria had stopped eating entirely, her attention focused solely on her son's conversation. The only sound in the room was the persistent drumming of rain against the windows and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "We'll be right there," James said, ending the call. He looked up at his mother and wife, his face grave. "There's been an accident at the elementary school. A gas leak caused an explosion during the after-school program. Margaret says they're bringing in at least 15 injured children, some in critical condition." Helena's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God, those poor babies." Victoria's reaction was markedly different. She carefully placed her napkin beside her plate and straightened her shoulders. "Well, I suppose Margaret will be busy tonight. We should probably postpone our discussion about the foundation board meeting." "Mother," James said, incredulous, "children are dying. And Margaret is a surgeon, not a miracle worker." Victoria replied coolly. "Getting emotionally involved won't help anyone." Helena stared at her mother-in-law in shock. The woman's ability to compartmentalize tragedy into inconvenience never ceased to amaze her. "We should go to the hospital." "To support Margaret." "That's hardly necessary," Victoria said, rising from her chair with practiced grace. "The hospital staff are perfectly capable of handling the situation. Our presence would only get in the way." But Helena was already standing, her mind made up. "James, we need to go. Your sister needs our support. And those families..." She couldn't finish the sentence, thinking about parents receiving the worst phone call of their lives. James looked torn between his mother's expectations and his conscience. The indecision played out across his features like a silent movie, years of conditioning, warring with basic human decency. "Go if you must," Victoria said with a dismissive wave, "but don't expect to accomplish anything meaningful. Hospitals are no place for people like us." Catherine's Children's Hospital was conducted in tense silence. Rain hammered the windshield of James's luxury sedan as they navigated through increasingly heavy traffic. Emergency vehicles screamed past them, their sirens creating an apocalyptic soundtrack for the night. Helena stared out the passenger window, watching the city blur past in streaks of neon and headlights. "Mother means well," James said suddenly, his first words since leaving the manor. Helena turned to look at her husband, noting the defensive set of his shoulders and the way his grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Does she, James? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like she cares more about maintaining appearances than about human suffering." "You don't understand our family dynamics," he replied, his tone growing sharper. "We've always maintained a certain distance from situations like this. It's not callousness, it's pragmatism. It's heartlessness." Helena shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. "Children are hurt, possibly dying, and your mother's biggest concern is how it might affect her social calendar." They pulled into the hospital parking garage, the fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh, sterile brightness. The elevator ride to the pediatric wing was filled with the sounds of controlled chaos, medical staff rushing through corridors, the beep of monitors, and the distant sound of crying. Margaret met them at the nurse's station, still in her surgical scrubs, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her green eyes burned with determination. At 53, she had never married, claiming her patients were her children. Tonight, that dedication was written across every line of her face. "James, Helena, thank God you're here," she said, pulling them both into a brief hug. "It's been absolute hell. We've got 12 children in surgery, 3 in intensive care, and more coming in. What can we do to help?" Helena asked immediately. Margaret's smile was grateful but weary. The families need support. Most of them are in the waiting room and the chaplain is overwhelmed. Just having someone to sit with them, to listen. She gestured helplessly. Sometimes that's all we can offer. Helena was already moving toward the waiting room before Margaret finished speaking. The scene that greeted her was heartbreaking. Parents clutching each other, grandparents praying in multiple languages, siblings too young to understand why everyone was crying. She approached a young mother sitting alone, her face streaked with tears, her clothes still covered in debris from the explosion. "Excuse me," Helena said gently, taking the seat beside her. "I'm Helena. Is there anything I can do for you?" "My son, Danny. He's 8. He was in the art room when it happened." Her voice broke. "They won't tell me anything." Helena reached out and took the woman's hand. "What grade is Danny in? What's his favorite subject?" For the next hour, Helena listened as the mother talked about her son, his love of dinosaurs, his fear of thunderstorms, his dreams of becoming a paleontologist. Around them, other families shared their own stories of the children fighting for their lives just floors above. Meanwhile, James stood awkwardly near the entrance, checking his phone and avoiding eye contact with the grieving families. When a father approached him, asking if he worked at the hospital, James mumbled something about being there to support someone, and quickly moved away. Margaret appeared periodically to update families on their children's conditions, her professional composure never slipping despite the exhaustion evident in her every movement. Helena watched her sister-in-law with growing admiration, seeing the way she managed to deliver both devastating news and hope with equal grace. As dawn approached, Helena found herself in the hospital chapel with an elderly man whose granddaughter was still in surgery. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun's first rays filter through the stained glass windows. The beauty of the moment felt almost obscene given the circumstances, but Helena found herself grateful for any sign of hope. "She's going to be okay," the man said suddenly, his voice rough with unshed tears. "My Sophia. She's a fighter, just like her grandmother was." Helena nodded, though she knew no one could make such promises in a place like this. Faith and hope were sometimes all that separated survival from despair, and she wasn't about to take that away from anyone. When she finally returned to the waiting room, she found James pacing near the windows, his phone pressed to his ear. From his hushed tone and defensive posture, she could tell he was speaking to his mother. The conversation ended abruptly when he saw her approaching. "Mother wanted to know when we'd be coming home," he said, not meeting her eyes. "And what did you tell her?" James's silence was answer enough. At that moment, Margaret emerged from the surgical ward, pulling off her cap and rubbing her temples. She approached them with slow, deliberate steps, and Helena could read the exhaustion in every line of her body. "How many?" Helena asked softly. "We lost one," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "A 7-year-old girl named Emma. Her injuries were just... there was nothing we could do." Helena felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her sister-in-law struggle with the weight of a child's death. This was the reality Margaret faced every day, the impossible responsibility of holding young lives in her hands. "The others?" James asked, finally showing some emotion. "Touch and go for 3 of them. The rest should recover fully, though some will need extensive rehabilitation." Margaret looked around the waiting room at the families who had spent the night in limbo. "I need to go tell Emma's parents." Helena watched Margaret walk toward a young couple huddled together in the corner, their hope and fear written across their faces. She knew that in moments their world would shatter completely. The injustice of it all, that some parents would take their children home while others would leave with only memories, felt overwhelming. "We should go," James said quietly. "There's nothing more we can do here." Helena turned to stare at her husband in disbelief. "James, these people have been here all night. They're scared and alone and... We're not trained counselors or medical professionals," he interrupted. "Our being here doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," Helena said fiercely. "Sometimes just knowing someone cares, someone is willing to sit with you in the darkness. That's everything." But James was already walking toward the elevator, his decision made. Helena looked back at the waiting room, at the families still hoping and praying, at Margaret delivering the worst news any parent could receive. She thought about Victoria's cold dismissal of the tragedy, about James's inability to connect with human suffering, about the vast gulf between the world she had married into and the world where she felt she belonged. As they drove home through the morning traffic, Helena realized something had fundamentally shifted during their night at the hospital. The careful facade she had maintained for 3 years, the desperate attempt to become the Whitmore wife Victoria expected, had cracked beyond repair. She had seen something real and vital in that hospital, something that made the artificial world of manor houses and charity galas feel hollow and meaningless. The question was, what was she going to do about it? 3 weeks had passed since the hospital tragedy, but Helena couldn't shake the images from that night. She found herself volunteering at St. Costio, Catherine's every Tuesday and Thursday, helping in the pediatric wing and supporting families during difficult times. The work gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since joining the Whitmore family, and she discovered a strength within herself that had been dormant for years. Victoria, however, was less than pleased with this development. "I simply don't understand this sudden obsession with sick children," Victoria announced during their weekly tea in the manor's sunroom. The October afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. Helena sat across from her mother-in-law, watching steam rise from her untouched cup of Earl Grey. "It's not an obsession, Victoria. It's called compassion," Helena replied, no longer bothering to soften her words. The hospital had changed her in ways she was still discovering, and chief among them was an inability to pretend Victoria's cruelty was acceptable. Victoria's eyebrows rose at Helena's tone. "Compassion is writing a check to charity, dear. Physically involving yourself in other people's misfortunes is unseemly. The Whitmore name has certain standards to maintain. Perhaps those standards need updating," Helena said, setting down her cup with more force than necessary. "When I see Margaret working 16-hour days to save children's lives, or watch parents praying over their sick babies, I don't see misfortune. I see humanity." "You see sentimentality," Victoria corrected sharply. "And it's unbecoming in a woman of your position. James has mentioned you've been spending more time at that hospital than at home. That's hardly appropriate behavior for a Whitmore wife." Helena felt her temper flare. What exactly is appropriate behavior for a Whitmore wife, Victoria? Hosting dinner parties for people we don't like? Attending charity events where we write checks but never actually help anyone? Pretending to care about causes we know nothing about? The older woman's face hardened into the expression Helena had come to know well, the one that preceded Victoria's most cutting remarks. "Appropriate behavior involves supporting your husband's career and producing the next generation of Whitmores, neither of which you seem particularly interested in accomplishing." The barb hit its intended target. Helena had always been sensitive about their inability to conceive, and Victoria wielded this knowledge like a weapon whenever Helena stepped out of line. But something had changed in Helena during those nights at the hospital. Watching parents love their children unconditionally, regardless of illness or disability, had shifted her perspective on what truly mattered. "Maybe the world doesn't need another generation of Whitmores," Helena said quietly. "Maybe what it needs is people willing to help instead of judge, to serve instead of expect service." Victoria's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "How dare you suggest that the Whitmore legacy is somehow dispensable? This family has contributed more to society than you could possibly understand. Through what? Business deals that make the rich richer? Political connections that maintain the status quo? Charitable donations that come with naming rights and tax benefits?" Helena stood up, her hands trembling with the force of emotions she had suppressed for years. "Where's the actual contribution, Victoria? Where's the getting your hands dirty to help people who can't help themselves?" "Sit down," Victoria commanded, her voice ice cold. "You're embarrassing yourself." But Helena remained standing. "No, I'm finally being honest, with you and with myself." At that moment, James entered the sunroom, still wearing his business suit from a day of meetings. He looked between his mother and wife, immediately sensing the tension in the room. "Ladies, is everything all right?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Your wife has been sharing her thoughts on our family's values," Victoria said, her voice dripping with disapproval. Perhaps you could explain to her why her current behavior is unacceptable. James loosened his tie and sat down heavily in his father's old armchair. At 45, he was beginning to show signs of stress, gray threading through his brown hair, lines deepening around his eyes. The family business was demanding, and the pressure to live up to his father's legacy weighed heavily on him. Helena, Mother mentioned you've been spending a lot of time at the hospital. I know Margaret's work is important, but perhaps you could scale back your involvement? Helena stared at her husband, searching his face for any sign of the man who had once swept her off her feet with talk of making a difference in the world. That man seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who cared more about appearances than substance. James, do you remember what you said to me when we first met? You talked about using the Whitmore resources to create positive change. You said you wanted to be different from previous generations. James shifted uncomfortably. I still believe that. But there are appropriate ways to create change and inappropriate ways. Getting emotionally involved with individual cases isn't strategic or sustainable. Strategic? Helena repeated, incredulous. We're talking about children, James. Sick children who need help. How is helping them inappropriate? Victoria interjected before James could respond. Because it reflects poorly on our family's judgment. People will think we're trying to absolve ourselves of some guilt, or worse, that we're publicity-seeking. Helena felt something snap inside her chest. Maybe I don't care what people think anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face went through several emotions: surprise, anger, and finally, calculated coldness. Perhaps, Victoria said slowly, it's time we discussed whether this marriage is working for anyone involved. James's head snapped up. Mother, that's... Mother, it's what? Victoria interrupted. Honest, your wife has made it clear that she finds our way of life distasteful. She's been married to you for 3 years and has failed to produce an heir. She spends her days consorting with people of questionable background in a hospital setting. She openly criticizes our family values. At what point do we acknowledge that this union has been a mistake? Helena felt the blood drain from her face. She had known Victoria disapproved of her, but hearing it stated so bluntly was still shocking. More surprising was James's reaction or lack thereof. He sat silently, staring at his hands, unable to defend either his wife or their marriage. You're right, Helena said finally, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring inside her chest. This marriage isn't working, but not for the reasons you think. She turned to James, whose face had gone pale. When did you stop believing in anything, James? When did you become so afraid of your mother's disapproval that you forgot who you wanted to be? Helena, please, James said weakly. Let's discuss this privately. But Helena was done with private discussions that led nowhere. No, James. I've spent 3 years having private discussions with you, hoping you'd find the courage to stand up for something meaningful. I've watched you choose comfort over conviction every single time. Victoria watched the exchange with satisfaction, like a chess player who had maneuvered her opponent into checkmate. Perhaps it's best if Helena takes some time to think about whether she truly wants to be part of this family. Helena looked around the sunroom, at the expensive furniture, the carefully chosen art, the symbols of wealth and status that had once impressed her so much. None of it seemed real anymore. The only reality she had experienced in months was in the sterile corridors of a children's hospital, holding the hands of frightened parents and watching Margaret work miracles. You're right, Helena said again. I do need time to think, and I know exactly where I'm going to do that thinking. She left the manor that afternoon with a single suitcase and no destination except away. Margaret had offered her the guest room in her downtown apartment, and Helena accepted gratefully. The space was smaller than Helena's walk-in closet at the manor, but it felt more like home than anywhere she had lived in 3 years. Margaret was working late surgery, so Helena had the evening to herself. She sat by the window overlooking the city, watching ordinary people live ordinary lives in the apartments across the street. A mother helped her young son with homework at a kitchen table. An elderly man watered plants on his fire escape. A couple cooked dinner together, laughing at some shared joke. There was something beautiful about the simplicity of it all. about lives lived without constant performance or judgment. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Come home. We can work this out." But Helena knew there was nothing to work out. The person she had tried to become for the Whitmore family wasn't her, and the person she actually was would never be acceptable to them. The gap was too wide to bridge with compromise or good intentions. Margaret arrived home near midnight, exhausted but oddly energized. She found Helena still sitting by the window, though the view had changed to scattered lights and empty streets. "Rough day?" Margaret asked, settling into the chair beside her. Helena told her about the confrontation with Victoria and James's refusal to take a stand. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally nodding with understanding. "You know," Margaret said when Helena finished, "I never fit into Mother's vision of what a Whitmore woman should be either. The difference is, I stopped trying to fit decades ago. How did you find the courage to be yourself?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting the city lights. "I realized that the only opinion that really mattered was my own, and I knew I couldn't live with myself if I chose comfort over conscience." "Victoria threatened to end my marriage tonight," Helena said. James didn't say a word to stop her. "Then James has made his choice," Margaret replied gently. "The question is, what choice will you make?" Helena already knew the answer. Somewhere between holding a crying mother's hand and watching Margaret save a child's life, she had remembered who she was before she became a Whitmore wife. That woman had been passionate about helping others, had believed in using her talents for meaningful work, had valued substance over status. The next morning, Helena called the nonprofit organization where she used to work. Her former boss was thrilled to hear from her and mentioned they had an opening for a senior designer working on campaigns for children's charities. The salary was a fraction of what the Whitmore family spent on a single dinner party, but the work would matter in ways that society events never could. She also called St. Dane T, Catherine's Hospital, and spoke to the volunteer coordinator about expanding her role. There were programs that needed development, families that needed support, and fundraising efforts that could benefit from someone with her marketing background. For the first time in 3 years, Helena felt excited about her future. James appeared at Margaret's apartment that evening, looking haggard and desperate. Elena met him in the building's lobby, not wanting to involve Margaret in what would undoubtedly be an uncomfortable conversation. "Helena, you have to come home," he said without preamble. "Mother was upset yesterday. She didn't mean what she said about ending our marriage." Helena studied her husband's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the nervous energy that made him fidget with his car keys. "Did you mean what you didn't say, James? When she attacked our marriage, when she criticized everything about me, you sat there in silence." "I was trying to keep the peace," he protested. "You know how Mother gets when she's angry." "I know how you get when you're afraid of her," Helena corrected. "And I can't live that way anymore." James reached for her hands, but she stepped back. "Elena, please. We can work through this. Maybe you could reduce your hospital volunteering, focus more on family." "Focus on what family, James?" Helena interrupted. "The family that treats me like an unwelcome guest? The family that measures my worth by my ability to produce heirs? Or maybe you mean the family I found at the hospital where people value kindness and service over social standing." "You're being dramatic," James said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Every family has its challenges." Helena felt a wave of sadness wash over her. James would never understand because he had never tried to see beyond his mother's expectations. He had been shaped by decades of conditioning that taught him to prioritize image over authenticity, and Helena finally realized she couldn't save him from himself. "I'm filing for divorce, James," she said quietly. The words hung between them like a physical barrier. James's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, desperation, and finally, resignation. "Mother will be furious," he said, as if that was the primary concern. Helena almost laughed at the predictability of his response. Even now, facing the end of his marriage, his first thought was of Victoria's reaction. "Then maybe it's time you learn to handle your mother's anger," she said. "Maybe it's time you figured out who you are when you're not trying to please her." James left without another word, and Helena watched him drive away in his expensive sedan. She felt relief more than sadness, like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. 2 days later, Helena received a call from a lawyer representing the Whitmore family. Victoria had apparently moved quickly to protect the family's assets, demanding a prenuptial agreement that Helena had signed in the romantic haze of engagement be strictly enforced. Helena would receive a modest settlement and could keep her personal belongings, but she would have no claim to the Whitmore fortune or properties. Helena signed the papers without argument, surprising the lawyer with her easy acceptance of terms most people would have fought. But she had learned something valuable during her time as a Whitmore wife. True wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or property deeds. It was measured in meaningful relationships, purposeful work, and the ability to sleep peacefully knowing you had lived according to your values. As she prepared to start her new life, Helena received an unexpected visitor. Margaret appeared at the apartment door with 2 cups of coffee and a proposition. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, settling into her familiar spot by the window. "The hospital needs someone to head up their new family support program, someone with your background and passion. The pay isn't much, but the work—" She trailed off, knowing Helena would understand. Helena accepted before Margaret finished explaining the details. For the first time since leaving the manor, she felt like she was moving toward something instead of running away from it. That night, Helena called her old friends, the ones she had lost touch with during her marriage. She was amazed by how quickly the conversations flowed, as if no time had passed at all. They wanted to get together, to hear about her experiences, to welcome her back to the world she had left behind. As she hung up from the last call, Helena realized she was smiling. She couldn't remember the last time she had smiled without conscious effort, the last time joy had felt natural instead of performed. Outside Margaret's window, the city continued its nightly rhythm, but for Helena, everything had changed. She was no longer trying to become someone else's idea of who she should be. She was finally becoming herself. 6 months into her new life, Helena had found a rhythm that felt sustainable and meaningful. Her divorce had been finalized with surprising efficiency. Victoria's lawyers ensuring the process moved quickly to avoid public attention. Helena had moved into a small apartment near the hospital, walking distance from both her new job and her volunteer work. The space was modest but filled with light, decorated with artwork from local artists and photographs from her travels before marriage. Her role as Director of Family Support Services at St. Catherine's had evolved beyond her initial expectations. Helena found herself coordinating between medical staff and families, developing programs for siblings of sick children, and creating support networks for parents facing long-term care situations. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply rewarding, and she discovered talents she never knew she possessed. Margaret had become more than a former sister-in-law. She was Helena's closest friend and trusted confidant. They often worked together on complex cases, combining Margaret's medical expertise with Helena's understanding of family dynamics. Their partnership had resulted in several innovative programs that other hospitals were beginning to adopt. It was during one of these collaborative sessions that their carefully constructed world began to unravel. Helena was in Margaret's office reviewing case files when Dr. Patricia Wells, the chief of pediatrics, appeared in the doorway with an expression that made both women look up immediately.
"Margaret, I need to speak with you privately."
"Dr. Sigmund," Wells said, her usually warm demeanor replaced by professional coldness. Helena began to gather her papers, but Dr. Wells stopped her. "Actually, Helena, this concerns you as well. Perhaps you should stay." Margaret gestured to the chairs across from her desk. Dr. Wells closed the door before sitting down, her movements deliberate and careful. "I've received some disturbing information about potential conflicts of interest in our family support program," Dr. Wells began, her eyes fixed on a folder in her hands. "Specifically, concerns about the allocation of resources and the selection of families for our assistance programs." Helena felt her stomach drop. "I'm sorry, what kind of concerns?" Wells opened the folder and withdrew several sheets of paper. Anonymous complaints suggesting that certain families receive preferential treatment based on personal relationships rather than medical need. There are also questions about the use of hospital resources for programs that may benefit the personal interests of staff members. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. Patricia, you know that's ridiculous. Helena's programs are transparent and needs-based. Every decision is documented and reviewed. I know that, and you know that, Dr. Wells replied. But the complaints have been specific enough that the hospital board is requiring an investigation. They're also concerned about the source of some of our recent donations.
Helena's blood chilled.
What source? The Whitmore Foundation has made several significant donations to the hospital over the past few months, specifically to fund family support services. The board wants to ensure these donations aren't creating ethical complications given your former relationship with that family. The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of hospital life filtering through the walls. Helena stared at Dr. Wells, her mind racing through the implications of what she was hearing. I had no idea about any Whitmore donations, Helena said finally. I haven't had contact with that family since my divorce. But you can see how it appears, Wells said gently. Your ex-husband's family funding your programs creates the appearance of impropriety, even if no actual impropriety exists. Margaret stood up abruptly. This is absurd. Helena has been nothing but ethical in her work here. If the Whitmore Foundation is making donations, it's not because of her influence. Helena had a sinking feeling she knew exactly whose influence was behind the donations. Victoria Whitmore was far too calculating to make charitable contributions without expecting something in return. The question was, what did she want? The answer came the following morning when Helena arrived at work to find James waiting in the lobby. He looked older than when she had last seen him, the stress of recent months evident in his posture, and the deeper lines around his eyes. He wore an expensive suit that somehow made him appear smaller rather than more imposing. Helena, we need to talk, he said without preamble. She considered refusing, but the hospital lobby was already drawing curious glances from staff members who recognized both of them. 5 minutes, James. In the family consultation room. They walked in silence to the small private room Helena used for difficult conversations with families. James closed the door and immediately began pacing, a nervous habit Helena remembered from their marriage. You need to stop what you're doing here, he said without looking at her. Helena sat down in one of the comfortable chairs designed to provide support during emotional conversations. What exactly do you think I'm doing here? You're embarrassing our family, James said, finally meeting her eyes. This whole charity worker persona you've adopted. It reflects poorly on the Whitmore name. Helena felt a familiar anger building in her chest. I'm not a charity worker, James. I'm a professional with a master's degree in social work, doing meaningful work to help families in crisis, and I'm no longer part of your family. So how does my career reflect on the Whitmore name? James stopped pacing and ran his hands through his hair. Because people still associate you with us. They see your name in hospital publications, they read about these programs you've developed, and they know you used to be married to me. It creates complications. What kind of complications? Business complications, James said evasively. Political complications. Mother has worked very hard to maintain our family's reputation, and your activities are making that difficult. Helena studied her ex-husband's face, noting the way he avoided direct eye contact and the nervous energy that suggested he was delivering someone else's message rather than speaking from his own convictions. Victoria sent you here, didn't she? Helena said. She's behind the hospital donations and the anonymous complaints. James's silence was confirmation enough. Helena felt a cold fury building inside her. Your mother is trying to sabotage my work because she doesn't want to be associated with someone who actually helps people instead of just writing checks. It's more complicated than that, James said weakly. There are business deals pending, political relationships that need to be maintained. Your association with this type of work sends the wrong message about our family's priorities. Helena stood up so quickly that James stepped backward. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Your mother is willing to jeopardize programs that help sick children and their families because my work makes the Whitmore family look too... what? Compassionate? Human? Helena, please try to understand. No, James. I understand perfectly. Your family would rather maintain a reputation for cold efficiency than risk being associated with actual kindness. And you're willing to destroy my career and hurt vulnerable families to protect that image. James looked genuinely distressed. But Helena no longer believed his emotional displays were authentic. There might be a way to resolve this that works for everyone. Helena waited, though she suspected she wouldn't like whatever solution James was about to propose. Mother has a proposition. If you leave St. Catherine's and take a position with one of our corporate foundations, she'll ensure the hospital receives a substantial endowment, enough to expand the pediatric wing and fund your programs for decades. The offer was delivered with the tone of someone presenting a generous gift, but Helena heard the threat beneath the words. Accept Victoria's terms or watch the programs she had built be destroyed along with her career. And if I refuse? James looked uncomfortable. The board investigation will find irregularities that require your dismissal and the dissolution of the family support program. The Whitmore Foundation will withdraw its donations, and there will be no funding to continue the work. Helena felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Victoria had engineered the perfect trap: accept exile to a meaningless corporate position, or watch everything Helena cared about be destroyed. How long do I have to decide? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady. The board meeting is next Tuesday. Mother needs an answer by Monday. After James left, Helena sat alone in the consultation room for nearly an hour. Through the small window, she could see the children's ward where Margaret was making rounds, checking on patients who depended on both her medical expertise and Helena's support programs. She thought about the families who had come to rely on the services she had developed, the children whose siblings found comfort in the programs she had created. Victoria's ultimatum was designed to be impossible to refuse. But as Helena considered her options, she realized the decision was actually quite simple. She had learned something important during her months at St. Catherine's. Sometimes the right choice wasn't the easy choice. That evening, Helena called Margaret to explain the situation. They met at a small cafe near the hospital, away from the institutional walls and potential eavesdroppers. I can't let them destroy the programs, Helena said after explaining Victoria's ultimatum. Too many families depend on these services. Margaret stirred her coffee absently, her mind clearly working through possibilities. What if we could expose what they're doing? Show the board that the complaints are fabricated. Victoria's too careful for that. She's probably covered her tracks thoroughly, and the board would rather avoid a public scandal than risk accusations of corruption. So, what are you going to do? Helena had been wrestling with that question all afternoon. The easy answer was to accept Victoria's offer and hope someone else could rebuild the programs in the future. But Helena had discovered something about herself during the past months. She was no longer capable of choosing the easy path when the right path was available. I'm going to fight, Helena said finally. Not the way Victoria expects me to fight, not through lawyers or public relations campaigns. I'm going to fight by doing exactly what she's afraid of. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Which is? I'm going to show everyone what real service looks like. If Victoria wants to play games with hospital politics, that's her choice. But I'm going to make sure these families have support regardless of what happens to the official programs. Over the weekend, Helena made a series of phone calls to her network of contacts from her previous career. She reached out to other hospitals, nonprofit organizations, community groups, and private foundations. She explained the situation carefully, focusing on the needs of the families rather than the political maneuvering behind the scenes. By Monday morning, Helena had assembled an impressive coalition of organizations willing to provide temporary support for the families currently served by St. Catherine's programs. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would ensure continuity of care during the transition period. She also had 3 job offers from organizations that valued her experience and shared her commitment to service over politics. Helena walked into Dr. Wells's office on Monday afternoon with her resignation letter and a comprehensive transition plan that would minimize disruption to families and staff. I'm sorry it's come to this, Dr. Wells said after reading Helena's letter. You've done exceptional work here. The work will continue, Helena replied. I've arranged for partner organizations to maintain support services for our families, and I'll be available to help train new staff when you're ready to rebuild the program. Wells looked surprised. "You're not going to fight this?" Helena smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't expected. "I am fighting this, but not the way they expect." That afternoon, Elena met with each of the families currently receiving support through her programs. She explained that changes were coming, but that help would continue to be available. She provided contact information for partner organizations and promised to personally ensure smooth transitions. The response surprised her. Instead of anger or disappointment, most families expressed gratitude for everything Helena had already done and determination to support her in whatever came next. Several parents offered to speak publicly about the value of the programs, while others volunteered to help with fundraising efforts for future initiatives. Helena realized that Victoria's strategy had a fatal flaw. It assumed that meaningful work could be destroyed by attacking institutional structures. But the relationships Helena had built, the trust she had earned, and the community of support that had developed around her programs couldn't be eliminated by board resolutions or funding manipulations. On Tuesday morning, Helena cleaned out her office while the board meeting took place one floor below. Margaret stopped by to help, bringing coffee and moral support. "Any regrets?" Margaret asked as they packed the last of Helena's personal items. Helena looked around the office that had been her professional home for 6 months. She thought about the families she had served, the programs she had developed, the meaningful work she had been able to accomplish. "None," she said honestly. "Victoria thinks she's won, but she's actually given me something valuable." "What's that?" Helena picked up a photograph from her desk. A picture from the hospital's family picnic showing dozens of children and parents laughing together in the sunshine. "She's shown me that the work matters more than the institution. That service is bigger than any single organization or family legacy." As they left the hospital together, Helena felt the same sense of liberation she had experienced when leaving the Whitmore Manor months earlier. She was walking away from security and stability again, but this time she knew exactly what she was walking toward. The next chapter of her life would be more challenging and uncertain than anything she had faced as a Whitmore wife. But it would also be completely, authentically hers. 2 years after leaving St. Cole, Catherine's Hospital, Helena stood in the conference room of the Matthews Foundation, watching city lights twinkle through floor-to-ceiling windows. The nonprofit organization she had joined as a program director had grown exponentially under her leadership, expanding their family support services to 12 hospitals across the state. What had started as a refuge from Victoria's manipulation had become a movement that was changing how medical institutions approached family care. Helena had found her calling in ways she never could have imagined while trapped in the gilded cage of Whitmore expectations. Her programs were being studied by medical schools, her methodologies adopted by hospitals nationwide, and her advocacy for family-centered care had earned recognition from national healthcare organizations. Margaret remained her closest friend and most trusted collaborator. Though she continued her surgical work at St. Catherine's, she also served on the Matthews Foundation board, helping Helena navigate the complex relationship between medical practice and family support services. Tonight's board meeting had been particularly significant. They were launching their largest initiative yet, a comprehensive family support program that would be implemented in pediatric hospitals across the region. The funding had come from an unexpected source, the Morrison Family Trust, a foundation established by tech entrepreneurs who had lost their own child to a rare illness and wanted to ensure other families had better support during medical crises. As board members filed out discussing implementation timelines and resource allocation, Helena allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The work they were doing would impact thousands of families, providing the kind of comprehensive support that she had dreamed of creating at St. Catherine's but never had the resources to fully implement. "Congratulations," said David Morrison, the foundation's chairman, approaching Helena with a warm smile. "This is everything we hoped for when we started this partnership." David had become both a professional mentor and personal friend over the past year. His own experience losing a child had given him deep understanding of what families needed during medical crises, while his business background provided practical skills for scaling effective programs. Helena found his combination of compassion and strategic thinking refreshing after years of encountering people who possessed one trait or the other, but rarely both. "Thank you," Helena replied, "though I think we both know the real work starts now." "True, but we've got the right person leading it." David paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Helena, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. Something personal." Before Helena could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. She glanced at the screen and saw Margaret's name. "I'm sorry, David. Margaret needs me at the hospital. Could we continue this conversation tomorrow?" Catherine's brought back familiar feelings of purpose and urgency. Helena had maintained her volunteer work at the hospital even while building her career elsewhere, unable to completely sever her connection to the place where she had first discovered meaningful work. She found Margaret in the pediatric intensive care unit, standing outside a room where medical staff moved with controlled efficiency around a small patient. Through the window, Helena could see a child who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, surrounded by the complex machinery that was keeping her alive. "Her name is Emma Rodriguez," Margaret said quietly. 7 years old. She was in a car accident 3 days ago. Severe head trauma, multiple fractures. Her parents have been here around the clock. Helena looked around the waiting area, noting the absence of family members. "Where are they now?" "That's the problem," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration. "The father had to return to work or risk losing his job. The mother is trying to care for their 2-year-old son while maintaining constant vigil here. They have no extended family nearby, no support system. The father is working double shifts to cover medical bills, and the mother is running on maybe 2 hours of sleep a night." Helena nodded, understanding immediately why Margaret had called her. This was exactly the type of situation that their programs were designed to address. But St. Catherine's had never rebuilt their family support services after Helena's departure. "What do they need most urgently?" Helena asked, already mentally cataloging resources. "Childcare for the son so the mother can stay here overnight. Financial assistance for the father so he can take leave. And someone to help them navigate the insurance complications that are already starting to pile up." Helena checked her watch. It was after 10 p.m., but she knew several people who would respond to calls even at this hour. The Matthews Foundation had developed a network of emergency support providers for exactly these situations. "Give me 20 minutes, Helena said. Within an hour, Helena had arranged temporary childcare through a church group that specialized in supporting families during medical emergencies, connected the father with a financial assistance program that would cover his lost wages, and scheduled a meeting with an insurance advocate who could help them understand their coverage and appeal any denied claims. More importantly, she sat with Emma's mother in the darkened hospital room, providing the kind of presence that no program could formally provide, but that every grieving parent desperately needed. "I don't understand how this happened," Maria Rodriguez whispered, holding her daughter's small hand. "Yesterday she was playing in the backyard, laughing. Now," she gestured helplessly at the machines surrounding Emma's bed. Helena had heard similar words from dozens of parents over the years. The sudden transformation from normal family life to medical crisis was always shocking, always incomprehensible. "You don't have to understand it," Helena said gently. "You just have to get through it. 1 day, 1 hour, 1 moment at a time." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Emma's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. Helena thought about all the families she had supported over the years, the incredible resilience people discovered when faced with unimaginable circumstances. "The nurse mentioned you used to work here," Maria said eventually, "that you helped families like us." "I did. It's the most important work I've ever done." Maria studied Helena's face in the dim light. "Why did you leave?" The question was innocent, but it brought back memories of Victoria's ultimatum and the choice Helena had been forced to make. She thought about how to explain the complex politics that had driven her away without burdening a grieving mother with unnecessary details. "Sometimes you have to leave a place to better serve the mission," Helena said finally. "I can help more families now than I could when I worked here." It was true, though the path to that truth had been painful and uncertain. Helena stayed until morning when Maria's husband arrived to take over the vigil and Margaret's shift ended. They walked out together into the early dawn, both exhausted but oddly energized by the night's work. "You know," Margaret said as they reached the parking garage, "Emma's case is going to be complicated. Long-term rehabilitation, extensive family support needs. The kind of case that requires sustained assistance over months or years." Helena understood what Margaret wasn't directly saying. St. Catherine's had no infrastructure to provide that level of support, and the Matthews Foundation's resources were spread across multiple institutions. What are you thinking, Maggie? Margaret stopped walking and turned to face Helena directly. I'm thinking it's time for St. Catherine's to rebuild their family support program, properly this time, with adequate funding and administrative backing. The board will never approve it. Not after what happened before. Margaret smiled with an expression Helena had learned to associate with her most ambitious surgical procedures. Confident, determined, and slightly dangerous. The board has changed significantly in the past 2 years. Dr. Wells is now chief administrator, and she's been advocating for comprehensive family services since you left. More importantly, we have new funding sources that aren't tied to the Whitmore Foundation. Helena felt her pulse quicken despite herself. The opportunity to return to St. Catherine's and rebuild what Victoria had destroyed was tempting, but she had learned to be cautious about institutional promises. What kind of funding? Corporate partnerships, federal grants, private foundations that actually understand the mission. And, Margaret paused dramatically, the Morrison Family Trust has expressed interest in making St. Catherine's their flagship implementation site. Helena stared at her friend, understanding the implications immediately. David Morrison's foundation was prepared to fund exactly the kind of comprehensive program Helena had always envisioned, and St. Catherine's had the medical expertise and institutional capacity to make it a model for other hospitals. David mentioned wanting to discuss something personal with me tonight, Helena said slowly. Margaret's smile widened. He's been working with doctors, Wells, for months to create a position that would allow you to direct both the hospital program and the foundation's regional expansion. It would be the best of both worlds, direct service delivery and systemic change. As they stood in the parking garage, Helena felt the familiar pull of possibility that had drawn her to meaningful work in the first place. But she also felt the weight of hard-earned wisdom about institutional politics and personal integrity. What about the Whitmore situation? Victoria's still on the hospital's board of trustees. Margaret's expression grew serious. Actually, there's been a development there too. Victoria stepped down from the board 6 months ago. Health issues, according to the official announcement. Helena felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Despite everything Victoria had done to her, she didn't wish illness on anyone, but she also couldn't deny the relief of knowing that particular obstacle to her work had been removed. Is she? Nothing life-threatening, from what I understand, but serious enough that she's had to step back from many of her commitments. James is handling more of the family foundation work now. Helena considered this information. James had shown moments of conscience during their marriage, times when his better nature had emerged despite his mother's influence. Perhaps without Victoria's constant pressure, he might make different choices about how the family's resources were used. I need time to think about this, Helena said finally. Margaret nodded. Of course. But Helena? Emma Rodriguez and her family, they're not the last case like this we're going to see. The need is only growing, and we have a chance to create something that could help thousands of families, not just here, but everywhere. The drive home took Helena through the city center, past the Whitmore building where James worked and the exclusive neighborhoods where she had once tried to build a life. She felt no nostalgia for that world, only gratitude for the journey that had led her away from it. She thought about Emma Rodriguez, fighting for her life while her parents struggled to hold their family together in the face of overwhelming circumstances. She thought about David Morrison, channeling his grief into resources that could prevent other families from facing such struggles alone. She thought about Margaret, using her medical expertise to not just save lives, but to revolutionize how medical institutions supported the people they served. Most of all, she thought about the choice Victoria had forced her to make 2 years earlier. At the time, it had felt like defeat. Now Helena could see it for what it really was, liberation from a small, fearful way of thinking that had kept her from discovering her true potential. Her phone rang as she pulled into her apartment building's parking lot. The caller ID showed David Morrison's name. Helena, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to apologize for not finishing our conversation last night. It's fine, David. Actually, Margaret filled me in on what you were going to discuss. There was a pause before David laughed. I should have known. Margaret's not exactly subtle when she believes in something. No, she's not, which is why I trust her judgment. Another pause, this one more hopeful. Does that mean you're interested in hearing more about the opportunity? Helena looked up at her apartment building, at the modest but comfortable life she had built for herself. She thought about the choice between security and service, between the known and the possible.
Yes!
She said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I'm very interested. 3 months later, Helena stood in a completely renovated family support center at St. Catherine's Children's Hospital. The space was larger and better equipped than anything she had imagined during her first tenure at the hospital, with comfortable meeting rooms, a children's play area, temporary sleeping quarters for parents, and offices for the team of social workers, financial counselors, and support staff she would be supervising. The Morrison Family Trust had provided funding not just for the physical space, but for a comprehensive program that addressed every aspect of family support during pediatric medical crises. It was exactly what Helena had dreamed of creating but had never thought possible. Emma Rodriguez was among the first families to benefit from the new program. Her recovery was progressing well, and her parents had been able to maintain both their jobs and their family stability thanks to the support services Helena's team provided. Margaret stopped by Helena's new office on opening day, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of satisfaction that Helena had rarely seen on her friend's face. Any regrets this time? Margaret asked, settling into one of the chairs designed for family consultations. Helena looked around her office, at the artwork created by former patients, the thank you letters from families, the strategic planning documents for expanding the program to other hospitals. Everything in the space reflected the values and priorities she had discovered through years of trial and error, success and failure. None, Helena said, and meant it completely. Through her office window, she could see the city skyline, including the Whitmore building where her former life had been centered. But that view no longer held any power over her. She had learned that legacy wasn't about maintaining tradition or preserving reputation. True legacy was about creating something meaningful that would continue long after you were gone. Helena had finally found her place in the world, and she intended to make the most of every opportunity to serve, to heal, and to prove that compassion was the most powerful force for change in any family, any institution, and any life touched by genuine care. As the first families began arriving for services that morning, Helena felt a deep sense of completion, not the kind that marked an ending, but the kind that promised new beginnings, built on the solid foundation of hard-won wisdom and unshakable purpose. Victoria Whitmore had tried to destroy Helena's work because she feared what it represented. The possibility that service mattered more than status, that love was more powerful than control, that the most important legacy was the lives you touched rather than the wealth you accumulated. In trying to defeat Helena, Victoria had actually freed her to discover her true calling. And now, surrounded by the evidence of meaningful work and genuine impact, Helena understood that the best revenge against those who tried to diminish you was simply to become everything they feared you could be.